Hello friends, my name is JJ, and you are watching an educational channel, which is to say a channel that hopes to teach you some stuff. But how do we decide what needs to be taught? What makes a good education? Well, this is a topic that interests me quite a bit, and I think that when you look at the modern philosophy of education, I would say there are basically three leading schools of thought, each positing a different idea of what is most important to teach. Theory 1 says that it's most important to teach practical life skills. Theory 2 says it is most important to teach the big ideas and arguments of wise people. And Theory 3 says it is most important to teach hard facts about the world. Now, obviously, everybody agrees on some level that learning all of this stuff is important, but most of us also have a bias that points us in one direction more than the others. You can even think of this in relation to the other educational YouTube channels that you subscribe to. Do you prefer watching videos that tell you stories about famous people, places, and events? Or do you prefer videos that give you instruction and advice on how to perform specific tasks and solve specific problems? Or do you prefer videos where people discuss different philosophies and ideologies or analyze and debate contentious topics? Over the last century or so, a lot of very smart people have spent a lot of time arguing with each other, trying to figure out which of these three approaches to education is best, which focus provides the best general education, and why. And today I want to talk to you about three of those smart people. So John Dewey is often held up as the father of the skills-based approach to education. He was a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago and probably one of the most famous and influential American intellectuals of the first half of the 20th century. He wrote a number of widely read books and papers about educational theory, and it is popular to say that his arguments laid the philosophical groundwork for how most American classrooms function today and how most teachers understand their jobs. Dewey was born in 1859 and was a big critic of the 19th century American approach to education, which he saw as too centered on bossy, authoritarian teachers forcing students to memorize big batches of irrelevant information. If you've ever taken a look at one of those 19th century grade school exams that go viral every so often, you'll know what he meant. A typical question would be something like, name the 6 most important generals of the Indian Wars and the battles to which they are associated. Dewey said that this approach failed to acknowledge the degree that man is a fundamentally practical creature inhabiting an ever more complicated world, and therefore primarily requires practical skills to navigate this world. This should not only include physical skills, like how to type or use scissors, but also intellectual skills, like how to do research or form a logical argument. And the subject of a lesson was less important than the general skills that could be acquired during that lesson that could also be applied to life outside of school. So when a kid does a report on dinosaurs, the most important thing is not the dinosaurs, but all of the reading and writing and coloring and pasting skills that he's using along the way. As he said in his 1915 book, The Schools of Tomorrow,
the function of the teacher must change from that of a cicerone and dictator to that of a watcher and helper. As teachers come to watch their individual pupils with a view to allowing each one the fullest development of his thinking and reasoning powers, and to use the tables of reading, writing, and arithmetic as a means of training the child's ability to judge and act, the role of the child necessarily changes too. It becomes active instead of passive. The child becomes the questioner and experimenter.
This became known as the philosophy of learning by doing, and it proved very persuasive. Like I said, it is easy to argue that we are living in a post-Dewey world, just given the fact that the idea that teachers should assist their students in learning how to be hands-on workers and engaged critical thinkers, rather than passive regurgitators of random facts, is now more or less conventional wisdom in America. But conversely, because this pragmatic skills-based approach to education was so influential, it has also become an easy target. Whenever a new study comes out saying that American test scores are declining or that large swatches of the public believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows, it is popular to argue that the learn-by-doing approach has failed. The argument goes that when we place less emphasis on the content of what is being taught than the act of learning, students will generally just gravitate towards learning things that interest them or seem easy. This criticism is particularly acute these days when a lot of schools, both at the grade school and post-secondary level, now gives students a great deal of freedom to decide what courses they want to take, or what books they want to read, or what topic they want to write their reports on. This seems to just be the natural way that people pursue education when left to their own devices. If you, once again, think about YouTube, to the extent that any of us are interested in continuing to acquire new skills outside of school, it is usually only in realms we are already interested in, doing things we are already pretty good at doing. Mortimer J Adler had been a student of Dewey when he was teaching at the University of Columbia, but really grew to dislike his philosophy of education. Beginning in the 1930s, he accordingly became America's leading proponent of an alternative ideas-based approach to learning, which made him another one of America's most famous public intellectuals with a legacy that is still very visible in the culture today. Adler shared Dewey's belief that a good education should primarily seek to empower the individual in the world outside of a formal school setting, but he thought the best way to help a person lead a happy, successful, and productive life was by learning from the wisdom of the past. Adler held that there were a finite number of important ideas in this world. They had emerged at the dawn of Western civilization back in ancient Greece and Rome, and had basically haunted humanity ever since. In the centuries that followed, various wise men had come forth and engaged with these big ideas in writing and speeches and plays and poems and novels, seeking to provide answers for how man should think about these ideas. What is love? What are the rights of a citizen? What is the best form of government? What is a just punishment for a crime? Working with a team of like-minded academics, in the 1940s, Adler came up with what he believed to be the definitive list of the great books of the Western world, 443 different pieces of writing by 74 authors that engaged with what were identified as the 102 great ideas of man. These great books were later sold as a set of literal books by Encyclopedia Britannica in what Adler viewed as a heroic act of democratizing elite knowledge for the masses. But he also believed that a great books-based education was basically the best form of education at every level from grade school on. He was extremely critical of the Deweyite idea of children getting to choose what to read and study. We know what they need to read and study, he said, and it's this. Adler was a pretty eloquent writer, and he spent a lot of time arguing at length about why his philosophy of education was the right one. Here is an excerpt of a 1960 essay he wrote as part of a cover story in Wisdom magazine, which apparently was the thing that existed at one time.
Experience is not enough. It is also necessary to think reflectively, to ask questions, to seek answers. Reading what other men have thought helps us think about our own experience. It is here that the great books are so much better than all others. They raise the most fundamental questions about man and his world, and they propound the most fundamental answers. That is why the great books can help to make our experience more intelligible to us. They are the books we must read to make the most out of our experience and out of all the other things we read or hear or see. To become liberally educated involves more than becoming well-informed. It is not a process of burdening one's memory with more and more facts, but rather of deepening one's understanding with more and more relevant ideas. Ideas are needed to understand facts and to weigh them. A man is wise in proportion as he can judge facts in the light of principles and thereby understand what he knows.
Now, one of the big criticisms of Adler's approach was just that it was way too fixated on abstractions and philosophy at the expense of real-world things. Likewise, even as a method of intellectual development, attempting to decipher the meaning of an essay written hundreds of years ago in dense, archaic language will strike a lot of people as a deeply inefficient way to learn anything. I was watching a 1970 interview that Adler did with William F. Buckley, and even he seemed willing to concede that understanding some of these ancient writings was in fact extremely difficult and time-consuming.
I've now been teaching the great books, reading The Ethics and the Politics and the Republic and John Stuart Mill for some 50 years. And I assure you, I know this is going to sound strange, and I hope you'll find it at least partly credible, that I've only begun to understand the ethics on the 10th, 15th, or 20th reading. It is not a book that Aristotle is not an easy writer.
Another criticism was that Adler's fixation on the ideas of books and thinkers made him incurious about the historical and social context in which those books and ideas were created. So like, some would argue that you cannot really understand René Descartes without also understanding the religious and political climate of 17th century France. But none of Adler's great books are of history or biography or hard science or anything like that. If you did attempt to analyze the historic and social context of his book list, it would be easy to walk away with the impression that basically all important thinking has been done by a group of relatively well-off white men in Europe. Now, in fairness to Adler, there was an easy fix for these sorts of criticisms. All he had to do was update his list of must-read books to include more modern writers and writers representing more diverse backgrounds, but Adler himself was never particularly receptive to this kind of feedback and became more stubborn and frankly even somewhat more bigoted as he aged, arguing that the authors that he cared about were the only ones that mattered, and say women and black authors were mostly irrelevant in terms of their engagement with the great ideas. But that said, there are still plenty of people out there today who believe that his approach to education was basically the right one, which is to say that the surest path to acquiring useful wisdom is reading the theory and arguments and reflections of great thinkers past and present who have pondered the great questions of humanity much more deeply than you or I.
This is a book that you have to sit with, that you have to grow with, that you read over and over and over again, and you start to understand over time.
Philosophical reading lists and book clubs continue to be a popular style of education, particularly among people who aspire to be great intellectuals or philosophers themselves, though that might be revealing. The scholar who best embodies the third approach to learning is someone who I have talked about on this channel several times in the past, E.D. Hirsch, who has been quite influential to me personally. Hirsch was yet another professor, and his rise to fame occurred in the 1980s with a philosophy that was in some ways a kind of compromise between conventional skills-based Deweyism and the prescriptivism of the great books crowd. He proposed a return to the fact-based education of the past, but with a more modest and in many ways utilitarian theory of why facts mattered. We should learn facts, including names of generals and other things that might not seem directly relevant to our lives, not to worship random trivia, but because other people know that stuff. And knowing what other people know is the key to effective communication with your fellow man. It was an anthropological view of education in the sense that it sought to acknowledge the role that knowledge played in American society as it actually existed. In his most famous book, he wrote,
"An anthropological theory of education accepts the naturalness as well as the relativity of human cultures. The anthropological view stresses the universal fact that a human group must have effective communications to function effectively. That effective communications require shared culture, and that shared culture requires transmission of specific information to children."
He called this theory of education cultural literacy, adding,
"Cultural literacy is represented not by a prescriptive list of books, but rather a descriptive list of information already possessed by literate Americans."
Even the most basic forms of communication, like speaking and reading, presume some understanding of the topic of that communication. In other words, even if you are completely fluent in English, you still need another level of cultural fluency to fully comprehend what the other person is trying to express to you. So for example, earlier in this video, I made a casual reference to William F. Buckley without explaining who he was. He was an important guy, so I took it for granted that you were aware of him. But if you didn't know who he was, which is to say, if you were culturally illiterate about William F. Buckley, then that clip probably communicated less information to you. If we want to go through life able to communicate with the greatest number of people and consume the greatest diversity of media, we thus have to accumulate a lot of fact-based knowledge. Stuff like the names of famous people, the dates things happen, scientific terminology, the plots of novels, the identifying characteristics of different genres of music, and so on. You don't have to know a lot, just enough to get by. Or as Hirsch once put it when criticizing Adler,
"I'm not interested in whether anybody ever reads Romeo and Juliet. I'm interested that when Romeo and Juliet is mentioned, people will know what I'm talking about.
Rather than being individualistic, fact-based education can be seen as more communitarian in the sense it doesn't aspire to make you a paragon of talent or enlightenment, just lets you communicate better with your fellow man and strengthens the collective culture as a result. Partially for this reason, the fact-based cultural literacy theory of education quickly became conservative coded, and to this day, when conservative politicians push for educational reform, a lot of the time they do this by pushing lists of need-to-know facts. And this opens up fact-based education to similar criticisms of the sort leveled at great books and ideas-based education. People argue what qualifies as a fact worth knowing, and whether the curation of the need-to-know list is being biased in one direction or another in order to elevate someone's opinion of what matters over someone else's. Hirsch himself has always argued that cultural literacy should be understood in a non-ideological way, and that lists of facts worth knowing should always seek to reflect what the culture as a whole considers important rather than any one political party, government, or even teacher. And this is something that's worth keeping in mind when we think about the ways in which adults consume fact-based educational content after they're finished with school, whether that be through books or podcasts or YouTube videos or whatever else. Are we seeking to consume fact-based information that fills our gaps of knowledge and increases our ability to communicate with a diverse array of people? Or are we simply seeking to consume information that is interesting to us and thus easiest to consume? It is basically the same question that critics of Dewey asked when it came to learning skills, and while easiness is obviously not something associated with reading the great books, bias of taste certainly is. Now, despite their considerable differences and disagreements with each other, Hirsch, Adler, and Dewey have a lot in common. They all believe in education as a fundamentally democratic exercise, a tool to lessen inequalities between people and build a healthier political culture. They all likewise believed that education wasn't something that could be done thoughtlessly. Educating others and yourself was something that had to have a coherent motivation behind it, with all three men formulating new theories of education in response to what had come before. And today, I think we can see the legacy of all three of them in the culture of learning and education that defines modern America. I don't think there are many people that would argue that learning skills, facts, or ideas are unimportant. And most of us probably think that a good education isn't simply a matter of doubling down on one option over another, as much as getting the overall balance right. And on that note, let me ask you what your preference is. Since you are watching my channel, it might be fair to assume that you are more of a fact person, but then again, this video has been mostly about philosophy, so maybe you're an ideas guy. I didn't really teach you any practical life skills, so I doubt you're one of those guys, but who knows? But let me know which one of the big three priorities you think deserves the most attention and why, and I will see you next week.